Brad LaPlante. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Good, man. Good. So you and I got connected because you represent the union that essentially represents the Forest Service, the federal Forest Service within the state of Idaho. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I'm with the National Federation of Federal Employees, Local 1753, which is the Payette, the Boise, and the Salmon Chalice. And we're really close to completely organizing the Sawtooth National Forest as well.
Now, with the Forest Service, you guys do forest management, which includes a lot of different things. So if you wouldn't mind, just explain to me all of the things that are included in like your purview of work.
So, like usually at a district office or even like a forest, we'll manage anything between like recreation, develop campgrounds, timber, which includes logging, silviculture, which I'm in, which includes like fuels and then also logging as well, and then replanting forest. We have trails, Salmon Chalice, they'll have like a river ranging. So they just kind of patrol the middle fork and make sure like everything's working out. Fire's a big part of the Forest Service, where if you see the green trucks around, those are your fire services, and they usually have probably, I would say that's our biggest contingent, and they're stationed almost in like every town, if not like 2 trucks and then hand crews, and then like in McCall, we got the jump base and everything like that. Also just, we got archaeology.
In case you stumble upon like native artifacts and stuff?
Yeah, they actually do stumble upon a lot of native artifacts, or even like going into old mining towns where they have like a lot of different Chinese artifacts, and just anything where you'll just stumble upon like old wagon wheels out in the woods or anything like that. We also have wildlife, which usually includes anything you might find in the forest that is, animals and the whatnot. So elk, deer, wolves, cougars. We also have fish biologists, and then range. And range is basically like people who work with permittees, we call them, or lease owners who actually like range their cattle out in the woods.
There was just the sheep crossing this morning on 55. So you had Frank Shirts out there with, a lot of sheep, a lot of poo on the road.
Oh yeah. When I worked in the Sawtooth, there was always a lot of sheep.
Yeah.
Usually, and they'll have festivals for them when they come down, but they'll be driving them usually in Fairfield and things like that. They usually try to keep them from the Payette just because of the bighorn sheep. So they're trying to keep those two from because of a potentially like them
pneumonia. Oh no! Is it mating? I thought it was that domestic sheep had a strain of pneumonia that was really, really bad for the bighorn sheep, and if that jumped over to a wild herd, they'd have to wipe out the wild herd.
Yeah. I believe that is the case. I don't work in that area.
Sure.
They just always tell me why there isn't sheep in there. Like is generally. Yeah.
Gotcha. So you then, with the Forest Service, you do a dump truck of things, obviously. And, the one that I'm most familiar with is essentially fire and forest fuel management, which, obviously we need that for our range industry, right? We need people with cattle, sheep, all those things to have areas to go. Obviously, with fuel management for wildfires coming up, because we're coming to fire season, that's a huge thing. And this big wrangle that we experience, I as a civilian, but also talking to people, there's this tension between the federal Forest Service and then state Forest Service. And then even I had Charlie Lyons from the Rangeland Fire Protection Association. Mm-hmm. It's association, not agency, right? I can never get them right. It's an A. But groups of individuals who are people that are ranching, and they're certified in a manner that allows them to legally be engaged in firefighting as well. So you have this huge group and network of people all working towards preserving and maintaining our large landscapes. And you guys obviously take orders from the federal directives, and then sometimes those conflict with the state directives.
And that, I know that's kind of been one of those like issues that has popped up recently, or whether there's been a couple instances in other states where the fire would start on national forest land and then creep over into state and different things like that. But they've actually done a pretty good process with mitigating those together. I know that here in Idaho with the IDL, usually we see them at our fires, and then vice versa. We've helped them with their fires as well. So there seems to be a pretty good relationship. And that kind of starts here at, NIFC and areas like that. So I know that there's kind of this sort of relationship between the two that makes it seem like the Forest Service and IDL aren't really like kind of a little more apart when it comes to working. But I believe that like any fire that we've been to, especially fires like down here in the Boise area, you'll have the Bureau of Land Management basically on IDL and vice versa, like up there in McCall, that there seems to be a good relationship between the two to get out there and try to get to those fires and maintain them so they don't affect like either lands depending on where they're going.
Gotcha. Pull this a little bit closer if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
There you go. Yeah, get comfortable. Just take it with you like this. No problem. There you go. Question for you about BLM and your relationship with them, because we have two different large land management entities, federal entities, because we have the Department of Agriculture, and they have an interest in forest lands because we grow trees, right? And then you have Bureau of Land Management that deals with wide open spaces, land lease and things like that. And you guys are a Forest Service taking direction from the Department of Ag or the Bureau of Land Management, or both?
So we take direction from Department of Agriculture when it comes to what we do. And they're the Department of Interior, which is the Bureau of Land Management. If there is any overlap, especially with like fire organization, there's usually a process where they just kind of come together and have that sort of operations kind of run. We actually, this last summer, I went out and helped out in Villa, Oregon with the BLM. So there's always this kind of relationship where the mission is the same when it comes to firefighting.
Sure.
So as far as the direction go, it's basically just like land-based direction.
When you say the mission is the same, this is something that I've been, and we touched on it very briefly right before we started going. There's a problem with fires burning, right? So the fire, the mission should be everybody exists happily, right? We have ranchers that are happy. We have civilians that are happy. Everybody gets to recreate, all of these things. But how that is accomplished is a very, very complex question, because at the end of the day, you have to take into account, you could stop every single fire. Okay. But if you stop every single fire, then you reduce the natural depletion of fuel load. So then you have an increased fuel load. Okay. Well, then you have to mechanically remove that stuff either through the logging industry, or you guys go in and like clear out stuff, rake. I don't know what the deal with raking is. It's like, it comes up and it's like, I just envision with giant rakes. But anyway, so you have this fuel load management problem. Part of it can be done naturally by letting things burn. Part of it can be done mechanically by us, by removing it. Part of it could be industry, part of it could be all these other things, but there's no right answer, because when you start talking about bringing a logging industry in, well, now you got to it has to make economic sense. That's the first thing. You have a lot of people that get concerned about the logging industry from a species preservation standpoint. Okay, great. So like we have that problem, but the flip side of it is that fuel doesn't get removed. And so then we have fires that are going to roll through, but no, stop the fire, because we don't want fires rolling through because, smoke everywhere. It's like, okay, but we have to get rid of this fuel somehow, because if we don't, it's going to be like Apocalypse Now, and we're all going to like die in a nuclear ash winter or something. So if the goal is the same, which is to provide habitable spaces to recreate, grow, food, and us to exist, how do we balance all of those things?
And we had a pretty good thing going these last 4 years. So for instance, last week we were prescribed burning, which is a good part of fuels mitigation. And you can't do it from a massive kind of, in a massive area. So you kind of pick strategic areas And then you start to move those strategic areas into like sort of what we call interface areas.
Right. Wildlife urban interface.
Yep. Which will affect like where people live. But if you looked at, even here in Idaho in the last 10 to 15 years, you see a lot more people building up in these areas where there used to not be houses. So that threat's there, right? Where people are potentially losing their summer homes or even homes. But
what would areas like that be? Because I mean, obviously you could say foothills,
yeah,
right? But are there other areas where it's kind of like, look, man, you're going into an area that's not well advised?
So yeah, I mean, anywhere. I would say, going to Cascade, you kind of, if you drive around, and we always look at that differently when you're actually in the industry that is attempting to prevent fire or look at forest health to make it to where big fires can't happen is. You see a lot of homes and you see, there's probably like 100 trees around those homes to kind of give them that sort of privacy. And then you kind of see them building homes on the outskirts of these towns like in McCall or even, in Donley or Cascade. Anything that adds to that kind of goes in that process where, it's not limited anymore to a certain area, that it's actually expanded because, everybody wants to live in those kind of, at least recreate and have a house up in those mountains, that creates a bigger threat. But what we've started to do is kind of look at those areas and then just see what we can do to mitigate like potential fire from happening. So we'll put like 10,000 acres of ladder fills, in what we call non-commercial thinning. So we'll go in there and we'll start to cut down like all those baby trees or we call it regeneration that kind of comes in the mix to make that to kind of mitigate those fuels. And then we'll actually put do a lot of logging operations too. And what we're looking for in those logging operations, what we call like early sero or trees that are like less vulnerable for fire, right? So just, driving in this neighborhood, I see spruce everywhere. Spruce has a tendency when it does dry out, it causes a lot of water, like takes a lot of water resources from the ground.
Gotcha.
So it's actually would take anywhere between like 20 to 28 inches of water to actually make a spruce thrive. Uh-huh. But in our woods, we have a lot of things where a lot of the tree species in that area, don't meet like historical conditions. So that'd be like the grand firs and things like that. And so for the Payette, for instance, we would prefer if like ponderosa pine and Douglas fir kind of dominated the landscape and actually had spacing to where they're not competing against each other, because when they do compete against each other, you get potential for diseases or dead trees, and those are the fuels that could potentially start these wildfires.
Gotcha. So tree health and tree density actually leads to increased fire risk, not just because you have more trees in the area, but literally because more trees in the area mean they're going to be less healthy and less fire resistant.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. So when you have a healthy forest and you have trees that aren't ravenously competing with each other, they will be able to withstand a fire to blow through on the lower portions of it without losing the whole stand.
Yeah.
Oh.
And we have, and that's why we will do things like prescribed burning too, to take away that like rift fuel duction from the bottom. So usually if there is like a logging operation, like we're doing just on the other side of Brundage Road right now, we just logged it. Now, anything that's on the ground, we're burning, and then we're trying to dictate the species now that are actually in that area. So if you go into that area, like here in a couple of years, what you'll see is like almost a park-like setting of big, giant ponderosas that have pretty good spacing apart from each other.
But that takes like forever.
It does. And, as we talked about before we started this, is for the longest time, we used to just suppress fires, right? To not allow like fire to kind of just kind of burn on the ground for a little while. And because of that, the fuels that are actually there in the forest now that haven't been treated in one aspect or the other could potentially like burn a lot hotter and create like a bigger amount of like what would potentially burn.
And was that the impetus for the giant fire in Yellowstone, that they had continued to put it out and then fuel just built up?
Right around that time, that's when suppression started to happen at
Gotcha.
that sort of like kind of, you know, this start where they started that like 100% suppression aspects. What we've kind of done with treatment and what the Forest Service kind of concentrates on now is to represent that sort of aspect, because it's harder to let fires burn now, let them go and get going to where they expand. And there's been evidence of that in certain places, that now we sort of try to use treatment as a way of taking care of what that fire used to do a while back. So logging,
Sure.
and then also non-commercial thinning, and then prescribed burning.
Okay, and so when you're logging, you literally go through, you take down trees, and then do you sell them to like mills or?
Yep. So it's usually, it's always been kind of local. I've known they've done some projects before, like at big aspects where the Forest Service has kind of bidded on that to help mitigate that. Like if you go to Bald Mountain ski resort and places like that, they've done aspects of that. But for us, what we'll do is they'll decide on, the acreage to kind of put out there for potential logging. Then loggers will bid on it, and then it gets awarded, and then they can go in there. What we'll do is we'll go and kind of do pre-sale of what timber they're going to take out of there, and they potentially they'll just go in there. And I think right now in the payout, we probably have like 5 or 6 timber operations going on right now. So with kind of like the way things have kind of been happening in the national news with logging, a lot of our mills, and I always say this, like you can use a mill as a reference point, right? When you go buy a mill in Tamarack or Emmett in, I forget what the other town is up north of McCall, but you would see that like all of those mills, like yards, are completely full. So we provide them with quite a bit of, sales and material. So it seems like the industry is doing pretty well, but in order for them to kind of reach that level where they're going to bump up capacity, you would almost need like even more mills in the state.
Gotcha.
But the potential is there with the lands that we had. I think one of the timber, I'm not quite sure about the name that they just passed to kind of bump up our timber production around the country. One of the things that kind of, I call it the cart before the horse aspect of things, because I don't know if the logging industry actually could meet those demands. So it's either they would potentially need like investment or some type of stimulus to bump up their industry themselves. But just talking from loggers and everything like that, they don't necessarily have the workforce to actually do that production too.
Right. You can want it, but again, like if the demand is there, theoretically the free market would take care of it. But you also don't want it to be like a boom and a bust thing. This is one thing that's really interesting about the national politics on industries like yours, because you might have one policy that goes out under this administration, then the next administration comes out and they're like, no, kill it all. And if you were the guy who, developed the workforce and invested in, your human resources to engage in this stuff, or bought leases and contracts and stuff, then it's like, well, the demand goes away.
And I drive around the woods quite a bit and work out there quite a bit. I am 100% pro logging, just because, it sort of does at the forest level the same thing that I do at the non-commercial timber level, right? Where we go in there and we'll mitigate that. Well, you're talking about big timber stands that need mitigation as well. So there's, as far as inventory out there for logging, even in places where they didn't have to expand the acreage to say like this area gets logged now, that we could probably, there would potentially be enough logging to go around. But even in those expansion parts, if they did expand it, I think what they're looking at potentially now is like our roadless aspects of the forest, where we've kind of taken away the ability for people to get in certain part of the woods because they're no longer accessible. And I understand that that's where they've kind of looked into potentially opening it up, at least in Idaho.
Yeah, and there's also an increasing problem with different listed species, like the grizzly bear, right? Like that's a consideration that you guys have to take into account, not just when you're working, but also look where. If the grizzly, if like a group of grizzly took up residency in one of those transitionary areas where you have the interface between urban and wildlands, it's like it's very hard to start engaging in mitigation and treatment of that area because you can't mess around with the grizzly bears that are sitting there, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's probably like one of those things that is one of those areas that they look at in Montana and everything. I know in Idaho we have certain species that we kind of we've developed things where we can't treat that area, but even in like prominent areas. So for Idaho recently, there was the North Idaho ground squirrel. For southern Idaho's, it's slightly, I guess, similar to the whistle pig.
The whistle pig?
The whistle pig. I don't know if you've ever heard about. I'm originally from Mountain Home.
Dude, what's the whistle pig?
It's like the southern Idaho ground squirrel nickname.
My God, I gotta look up this.
Yeah,
keep going.
But anyway, so we've even developed, and as they develop, like what to do for treatment, it's still in a development in case. But if anything exists in that mindset, they usually do a pretty good job of like vetting the ability to still treat the woods and then work around those animals. So they're not like shutting down miles of potential treatment operations to avoid, animals. Like in Idaho, we'll have like the goshawk. And usually you kind of create a buffer if it has nested there, and then the midges as well. So we do a pretty good job of like mitigating that. All that process happened during the NEPA, which was passed in the early 90s.
What's the NEPA?
So
you got to talk to me like I'm 5.
Yeah. So yeah, acronyms. The NEPA is an environmental protection of like basically the woods. So all it does is require, like, if you're going to do some type of treatment or some type of operation, it just has a list of
impact considerations or something.
Yeah, that basically everybody gets a chance to kind of make their sort of like concerns known. If, like, for instance, if we'll talk about the mine that they're doing up there, the Stibnite mine.
Can we talk about the cobalt mines that stole all the farmers' water? Can we just talk about those for a second? I know you know. Nobody can point to it. Nobody knows where one is, but I know you know.
Yeah. Yeah, the Stibnite mine, they kind of like, okay, how would this mining operation affect like things that are going on around that area? So, wildlife will make their determinations.
Environmental groups can come forth and be heard.
Yeah.
Things of that nature.
Yep. And, they went ahead and still allowed it to happen. I know they're waiting on certain aspects of the permit and stuff like that. But the Forest Service isn't set up there because it's the land of many uses to actually allow for things like that. And that's where like timber will come into. Like the whole point of logging is to kind of, for both industry and the Forest Service, to benefit off one another and get the results that they want. So,
and the results that everybody theoretically wants, right? Yeah. Like, I think you can look at, and again, I'm sorry to hammer this point, but it's like a completely unaddressed, untreated, untouched wilderness. Yeah, there might be some very romantic aspects to that, but the violent aspects of nature will also come forth that we do not have to confront anymore, right? Like I remember reading an article years back about Native American Forest Management Service and reading about the history that the Native Americans had with managing the forests that they lived in and that they lived around. It's like even they, before we had contemporary logging systems, they understood it's like, look, we got to do some stuff to like, because we live here and, fire comes through and it's really crazy. And it's like, look, it's not great for us to have this untamed, unchecked forest and growth around us. It's just not good for anyone from a life standpoint, from a habitat standpoint. It's a bad habitat for humans to exist around.
Yeah, you can kind of tell too, because I mean, if you go into a woods, right, and you go into certain areas where the trees are thicker than they should be, you'll notice like the wildlife don't prefer those aspects. As opposed to a little bit more open ground. Sometimes they might, like we've worked with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and places like that to actually promote like aspen and a little bit more wide open spaces, because if you get any type of what we would refer to as conifer encroachment, then it has a greater effect on like what has happened, historically within your woods, more than actually just kind of thinking that this would be a natural thing because it isn't being touched now, right? Because if you go into, say, Idaho City, in that area, you'll kind of see like, or even like bigger valleys like Stanley, you'll kind of see where there's like, the trees have always been on the ridge line. They've been in the mountains and the valleys have kind of been open, right? But you'll kind of see that as the trees kind of creep into the valley a little bit more, it just seems to kind of take away from the landscape a little bit. And that's one of the reasons to promote like just those kind of treatment areas. So anything like that historically, or if anything that we kind of prejudge where we want to return the forest back to what we would originally deem it to where it was been thriving, that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And that's a really, you bring up a really good point, which is like, okay, let's leave this untouched today, because that would more accurately represent what this landscape has been. Man, this is really embarrassing. But I watched a full episode of Swamp People last night. It was just these like 6 dudes in the Florida Everglades going through trying to grab a bunch of boa constrictors and because they've killed all kinds, like 90% of the ground mammals and things like that. And it's like this huge problem. And these snakes are gigantic, right? They're like, 12 feet long, 120 pounds. And they're it's crazy, right? And then they're going out at night. And there's this one dude who only wears overalls. And he's like this big barrel chested dude. You can barely they put captions on him sometimes because you just don't understand what he's saying. Because he's from like Louisiana, right? And it was like a friend of theirs brought him out to Florida to like catch the snakes. And it's like, oh, what are they doing there? When you gonna get it? It's like straight out of, what's that movie, Billy Madison?
Yeah.
I think Adam Sandler, the Water Boy.
Yeah.
When the guy, the Bayou guy. Anyway, my point is, this is terrible explanation. But the point is, if you looked at the Everglades and you're like, okay, let's just leave the Everglades as a wildlife preserve from here on out. You're like, okay, but which version of the Everglades? The one that's overrun by snakes or the one that was before the snakes? And if we want to have an Everglades that was before the snakes, well, we have to do an incredible amount of work right now today. You see the same thing actually. I went to Berkeley for my undergrad, and again, I don't care for Berkeley. Just to be clear, everybody is like, oh, anyway. But they're in the Oakland and Berkeley Hills. They have these incredible eucalyptus trees that are these like gigantic trees. They explode, by the way. Sometimes, like they can combust. It's really bad because they have really big oils. And if you were like, hey, let's leave this area alone, you have to take into account that some idiot in 1910 brought in the wrong eucalyptus seed because he thought it was going to be the next hardwood, brought it in, chopped down all the redwood, planted the eucalyptus everywhere. They're like, oh, shoot, this is the wrong one. Like we brought in the wrong eucalyptus. And now you can't use that eucalyptus for anything. It's completely dominated the landscape. So compared to 100 years ago, you have a completely different landscape that if left unchecked, will literally just spontaneously combust. Like the whole thing will go up in just some cloud one day, which, we saw, I think it was like the 80s or 90s when there were the big Oakland fires. Anyway, the point is, you bring up a great point, which is, look, we can all want to have this like natural preserve and be conservationists, but you got to understand as well, like there are other things encroaching or invasive species or different types, like you're saying, like Doug fir encroachment or something like that, that's going to change the landscape. That's not how it originally was, even though it may be what it is right now.
And you could take like an aspect of climate change, which is,
I don't think you can say that word.
I don't think you can say it anymore. Not in my profession.
CC.
But with temperatures getting a little bit warmer, just the climate changing in general, is what we'll do is we'll actually use that as like a way to go in and be like, okay, of all these trees, Like the blue spruce probably takes some more water, and then the spruce, and then you kind of work down that pecking order. So you're like, how can we preserve and make this forest actually healthy? Where do we start? And usually in our case, it starts with the Doug fir and then kind of works its way up. So we know that, like, not only through encroachment. So in our woods, the grand fir has kind of worked itself into non-historical areas. So usually during logging operations, we'll go in and we'll take out the grand fir to a certain point, and then start working our way down the list to preserve like things like the ponderosa pine, which is a little bit more drought resilient.
Gotcha.
So that's what we go in there to look at from a logging aspect, about trees that the loggers can potentially cut down and actually take out of the woods to help with that sort of aspect of climate change.
Dude, that's wild times. This is wild. I would love to come and spend a day with you guys.
Yeah.
If you'd have me going through the forest, identifying different trees and figuring out different ways to manage it, just so I could see the landscape. Because I mean, I've heard about it, and you're obviously telling me about it, but I've never been there. Where you're like, oh no, that's a ponderosa. That guy's great, but that that guy's sucking water like a like a sponge, just to see the enormity of the task too, because you're dealing with gigantic tree systems and gigantic areas. And even if you get into somewhere where you're like, okay, we're going to take this, you still got to get it out, which is, I have to imagine, a train wreck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a process because, a lot of times some of these operations they overlap years, right? So you recognize an area, we lay out that area for potential logging, and then it takes another year or two to actually have that logged. So we're usually between layout and actually getting it logged is like a 3 or 4 year process.
Do you have any of those baller skit loaders that have the grabber arms that literally grab on, then the chainsaw's like, and the thing falls down, and then it runs it like conveyor belts it through and chops off the branches as it goes, and then you just have a pole and then a big pile of rubble?
So most of the logging companies do.
But you guys don't have one?
No, we don't have that.
I wanted to drive it so bad. Can you just rent one just for a day, and you and I can drive it, and we'll just videotape it? They look so cool. Those videos on like Instagram, I'm just dying when I watch them. Like, God, what a cool job. Horrifying in case a tree falls on you, but like super cool besides that.
You should go up to the University of Idaho, their forest research center. And they've actually let their students kind of play with those things a little bit. They might let you.
Come on, hook it up, Brad. You got to know some people in the industry. Be like, I got an idiot, but he'll listen to instructions and just let him like drive the dumb thing. Don't kill himself. Like, just let him do one tree, a little one, just a little dumb one. Yeah. Knowing all this, like, you guys are checking so many boxes, and it takes such expertise. Like, what has been your experience with obviously the federal conversation around restricting budgets? And it's like, those, it's like, do you have a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse that you feel is something that you could trim out from your operation?
I think everybody kind of takes that in consideration, because when you kind of look at the aspects of how budgets work, and I was in the military for a bit, so I started in the military right around the time Afghanistan and Iraq kicked off. And then you kind of had this big surplus thing. And then, and then all of a sudden, like 07, 08, they started to want to scale back. So it went from like, nobody can leave to, hey, if you guys want to leave, please leave kind of thing.
Sure.
I believe it was called Surge. And then I forget the nickname for the other. From a Forest Service concept, I think it always seemed like we were doing pretty well when it came to what they wanted us to do, as far as, budget and all that. People always think that they were a little top heavy with more planning than actually people out in the field doing the work. But I think we just kind of got caught up in the whole like national thing about just like making government less, because we still have a mission. If you think about the Forest Service in general, and how you recreate and where you recreate, you can basically go and camp in the forest for free, right? There are developmental campgrounds where it does cost money, but you can basically go do things for free in the forest. So, if you look at funding, you have like non-appropriated funding and then appropriated funding. So we were more or less like appropriated funding so taxpayers can go enjoy the woods that they pay for. So if you think about it, if they start to to lessen that appropriated money, then there's not going to be the operations to allow people to go in there and actually enjoy those aspects of woods. You kind of get the sense that, say, for instance, everybody, when they go up to redfish, they see that gate, right? They see the gate where they first enter redfish. Have you been up to redfish? Haven't you? Yeah. It's a great place.
Great place. My wife is at midnight with the registration, like every
it's a good camping spot.
Oh my gosh, she is like, oh yeah, we got good spots.
And those are like, that's available, and those people actually pay for because that is what you would consider development, right? But you can go a mile down the road and camp for free. You just won't be there in the lake.
Yeah, you won't get all the amenities, and you don't get to park there, and blah blah blah.
But if you think about like the people who work there, and then as well as the people who go there and take care of the trash and do all those things, that's just part of the process that the Forest Service also takes care of. And if you take away that kind of funding to be able to fund the staffing that actually does that, then, we're not going to have people to do it. So we've more or less been told like, hey, you might have to do extra things. So, while I'm up there to go help try to figure out what to mitigate forest-wise or where we should plant, I might have to go clean a campground or two, which is going to lessen my abilities. But, as I was saying, like even there in redfish, you get like, you can enter that place and instead of paying like $10 as if you were to go into Yellowstone or something, you're just able to go into redfish and enjoy the lake or go out there and enjoy the woods. And these are the aspects of what taxpayer money does. So that taxpayer money funds the people who actually, like do things out in the woods, keep the trails clean, which is kind of a big aspect. Because I'm sure you've been on quite a bit of hikes in the mountains and there's always down and dead.
Yeah, right.
And our trails crews, they'll go in there and clean up make sure you don't have to basically, be hurdling the whole trail, because if you're doing like 10 to 15 miles on a trail, the last thing you want to do is hurdle over every single tree. So that's what our trails crew do. But, it's certain aspects of looking at the cuts that they brought into the table that kind of like made trails, made rec, made certain aspects of the Forest Service less and less, so we're not going to be able to complete that mission. And I think that impact is definitely going to show this upcoming summer, because, we've taken quite a big hit. Now,
if I may ask, like how big of a hit did you guys take?
So here's how it kind of rolled out, right? So originally what happened was we used to have what we call 1039s. So those 1039s were just, it's like just a number for a name of people who were seasonal employees, right? And I know, in Idaho, there's been a lot of people who have worked for the Forest Service before that might do other things now, but 1039s were what we call seasonals. They were originally hired to just kind of work the summer months and just a little bit over the summer months to do projects. What happened was about 3 years ago, they decided to convert all those like temporary seasonal positions to permanent positions for whatever reason. I think it had a lot to do with retention, but because of the market, we weren't really able to fill all those positions the way that we could because, hospitality was paying so much. And I'm sure you've been up to McCall that people would rather work at Ice Cream Alley than out on the trail because, you're talking like $14-15 an hour, where hospitality, there were places that were paying cooks like in the 20s to work in McCall.
I'd work at an ice cream shop. Like in the AC, all the ice cream you can have, you get tips. Like ain't nobody tipping you out on the trail. You don't have to worry about breaking your ankle or chainsawing your leg off. I mean, you probably don't, but like I would worry about chainsaw. Like I'd take Ice Cream Alley all day, man.
Yeah, I mean, the novelty of working in the woods. When it came to what we used to get, as people kind of developed like whatever careers they wanted to do in the Forest Service. The Forest Service kind of had it set up to where everybody like had to start at the bottom and then work your way up to get up to like ranger and forest soup, you'll find that a lot of people in Forest Service management have done these things when they were younger. And that's just the way the system was created.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. If I was a college student, I'd go into the forest for sure.
Yeah.
Like go out there 2 months, 3 months, make some money, but just be going hard. If I was like 19 and 20, hell yeah, man. That would actually be really cool. Now I'm like, give me the ice cream alley. I'm an old man.
Well, and it covered that necessary time, right? It covered that necessary time that most college kids would, so you can kind of get them into those positions and then anywhere. But anyway, so as they converted those positions, a lot of those employees kind of got stuck in this probationary period, which kind of became a thing in February when they ended up terminating all those employees. So one of the biggest aspects of that was a lot of these people had already worked as 1039s, and some of them for like multiple years. And they kind of said, oh, these are probationary employees. These are new employees. So, getting rid of them isn't the end of the world. But for the Forest Service, a lot of these people were actually the people that worked out in the field. So
that were tried and true, understood the system, the program, and were actually long-term employees. But by the nature of the work, they were just, they were viewed as probationary.
Right.
That's rough.
Well, and it can happen. So it could happen like if I was to take a different position. That I would go back to being a probationary employee if the position was different. But not only those guys, but also like Schedule A, which hit veterans quite a bit across the country, because the veterans were the ones like myself. I didn't get off probationary. I started working for the Forest Service in 2020. I worked 2 seasons as a 1039, and then I got a full-time job. So I was on probation until June of 24. So then, wrap around a year, it could have been potentially me that was terminated. So what happened was they went to the appeals, the merit board, to actually appeal that these employees, they couldn't just terminate, which they did at the time. And the OPM did, and then all the rulings came down. So a lot of those employees came back and started working again. But then originally they offered the deferred resignation. And just to kind of explain that, is the deferred resignation allowed employees to get paid through the end of this fiscal year, 2025 fiscal year, October 1st, and then they would just lose their position.
Right. So it's like a big severance package.
Nobody originally took it because it was kind of new and nobody quite understood it. But then, the small aspect of people who did take it, a lot of those probationary period employees, once they offered it again, because they offered it again like a month ago, ended up the numbers ended up matching what the original terminations of probationary employees. So now we're looking at, I would probably put it in the forest that we represent in NIFI here in Idaho. There was probably close to 100 people.
Gotcha.
And we're talking
out of how many?
So out of how many of who we do represent, that would be like 100 out of the 700 or so, gotcha. Or so like that. But that's just
that's a big chunk of people though.
And that's in each forest, right? So every forest, I would say on average, is probably in the upper 20s, lower 30s, but those are in critical field positions, right? So anywhere between trails, rec. There's been some people in other areas too, front desk and things like that. Our public, where we got hit, the public will definitely feel that kind of impact, right?
Gotcha. It's not just, not to be derogatory, but it's not just paper pushers. You're dealing with people that were going out clearing functional aspects of the forest that we interact with on a daily basis.
Yeah. And it's the kind of people you see everywhere. And a lot of times, because there's a confusion about people's roles in the Forest Service, because, you'll see a white truck, used to be a light green truck kind of driving around, and you're like, oh, that's a Forest Service. A lot of these people did a lot of other things too. So we all pretty much fight fire in one aspect or the other.
Sure.
So we're losing a good amount of personnel who would actually help with fires if they do develop. And then, And then we ended up losing quite a bit of people like in support positions, but then just like people driving around the woods, because a lot of times, when people go out and camp, they will get their fires going, and we might not even be in restrictions or anything, but these are a lot of people that probably put out like quite a bit of fires that people didn't completely put out, or don't start smoldering again until 1:00. So just having as many eyes out there to kind of drive around, and even in your day-to-day activities to kind of just help with things, or picking up trash, which, a lot of people won't think, but if you ever go to like a Forest Service outhouse pullover bathroom, you'll notice that somebody's like, oh, I don't know what to do with my camping trash. I'll just leave it here in the bathroom, and somebody will come and get that for me. The magical trash fairy. Oh, it's a
AKA Brad.
Yeah, AKA Brad. It might be Brad, even though I'll be headed out to the woods to still try to mitigate the fuel levels for potential fires.
Yeah.
I'll still probably.
Now you got poopy diapers just festering in the summer heat in the back of your truck.
Oh yeah.
Oh God.
No. I mean, it's a possibility.
Oh, listen, I know it's a possibility. I mean, you go camp. Yeah, you go camping, and it's like you take your little kids out there camping. You got dirty diapers, and it's like a gajillion degrees, and it's just cooking.
Oh yeah.
Oh God. And then they drop it off for you. What if I would have taken the retirement just off that? Like, I can't handle the cooked diaper.
And I think a lot of people were very scared because they were like, well, if they could have fired me a couple months ago, they could still probably fire me again, right? Because there's no protections, or at least, the protections could be, generally, they're not there if it became a possibility already, right? It's not so much like, okay, we understand we have an operation and needed a necessity. We just needed somebody there to actually, represent the Forest Service to actually say that. And that's kind of where we sort of come in, because we do a lot of lobbying, right? So I know you had Simpson on a couple of weeks ago, but we actually did a lot of lobbying last June to get the Wildland Firefighter Pay or Permanent Pay Act passed through, which actually increased like pay for them. Or we'll go in there and right now we have people in DC who are lobbying to kind of just like let representatives know exactly how important the Forest Service is to just operations in general, right? So they can't just take like a fine comb and, people have their disagreements on what should exist and what shouldn't. Should we give money to these people? Should we give money to those people? Should we support this program? But the Forest Service itself, the money that is given to the Forest Service to operate is kind of just important for getting, those missions done. So in a sense, it's like half tourism, half mitigation, or the, the land of many uses, because all that money or funding will eventually somehow work its way back into the economy.
Yeah. The ROI with keeping forest and wildlands available. I've had several people on that. Nick Fasciano from Idaho Wildlife Federation. I had Brian Brooks on, who's former executive director of IWF, but now he works for the American Bird Conservancy, Aviary Conservancy. And both of them, as well as other people, have been like, listen, man, the ROI, if you put like $1 billion into, forest management and all kinds of other things, the ROI is like 100 to 1, because you have so much that goes on in the forest, and you have so many industries and outfitters that get paid to do it. And then, obviously supplies, and then, recreational vehicles and recreational equipment. It's like, what would REI be? Like the stock for REI would drop like to zero if we took funding away. So it's like just the REI and outdoors, like any mountain stores and whatnot, those are all part of this larger web of economic, a large piece of this economic engine that's driven by promoting forest stewardship. And
I always look at it as like a reciprocating economy type thing where, where if we're given money to actually buy things, we're always obligated to put that back into the community.
Yeah.
Right. So go with these vendors or people who sell these things for you, and vice versa. Right. But you're talking in Idaho towns, some of the biggest employers, right? So if you go into McCall, just the 3 districts, the jump base and everything is like one of the bigger employers in that county, in Valley County. Same with New Meadows, same with Council in Adams County. If you go into Salmon, you'll find that there are a lot of people that work at the Forest Service. So they're, everything that you would pay them, depending on how many of them are there, that they would actually they are providing the lifeblood of those communities. It's gotten a little bit difficult lately because the cost of living in most of these Idaho mountain towns is just skyrocketed, right? We're talking, McCall and Boise are pretty, they're pretty close when it comes to that sort of thing. But if you think about your economic viability when it comes to actually having a job in McCall
that
compared
pays
to
for the housing.
Exactly.
You just bought a $900,000 house. Where's your job at Ice Cream Alley? That's paying for that.
Well, hopefully that restaurant has housing or things like that, right? Yeah. So even before all these cuts and everything, that was has been the concern post-COVID for most employees, and that's why we had a lot of open positions because people couldn't financially do it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Brad, there's a lot going on here, man. Good Lord. I've had you for a little bit here. I do have one more question. Are you optimistic about this fire season? Because we've had last fire season really, I remember chatting with the governor about it when he came on and a bunch of other people, and they're just like, man, it was brutal. And Dean Cameron, the director of the Department of Insurance, was saying when I had him on, I think it was January, February, he said, look, man, we're coming into an age of Idaho where we're going to have really rough fire seasons. What do you think as far as this fire season?
As far as weather, there are certain parts of Idaho which could be bigger than others. I know the Salmon Chalice has been a lot drier, and we did our fire outlook yesterday in a class, and the potential there is probably pretty significant, right? It's always going to be significant. It will depend on how hot June is. I've always kind of made that sort of judgment when it comes to theme or how much rain we'll get between now and before, it's actually warm enough to kind of grow that certain level of fuels there. I think as far as resources go, we're stretched, and we're hoping, with this Wildland Firefighter Pay Act that we'll actually start to fill a lot of those positions and to get our resources pretty good. But I don't think it'll be as, it won't be as bad as last year, I think. Last year was a fairly dry winter.
I love the way you talk, man. Hell yeah. Well, listen, I'd love to have you back on later in the season to kind of touch up on these exact things and hear how the hiring's going and everything, obviously. So thank you for coming in today. Is there anything you'd like to hit here at the end?
I just say community support is massive in this, right? Because we've kind of learned that, if our community is behind us, and they have been behind us as far as when people hear that Forest Service people are being affected by everything that's kind of happened, and people are like, no, this is the lifeblood of rural Idaho communities, that we've had a lot of people come out. But if we continue to get that support, continue for people to actually speak up for us and let people know how important the woods is, the forest, the mountain communities that everybody enjoys during the summertime, that would be massive, and just kind of showing, the people who are put in place to decide whether or not, people in the Forest Service even deserve to be there or have a job or dependent, or, the industry in general, that would be massive because, I grew up in Idaho. The Forest Service, the forests, our lands have always been the biggest kind of thing when it comes to our vacations, right? I never went on a vacation when I was a kid. There's been a few minors there, but my vacation was camping in the Idaho woods.
Right.
You just get used to it. And I lived in mountain homes, so we'd head up to Pine and Featherville. But how important it is can't be measured from, places that make those kind of decisions. So it's the only way for Idahoans to speak to their representatives and just let them know. And, and Mike Simpson's always been on board with everything to come with the Forest Service. But let your senators and congressmen know what Idaho lands mean to you and the people who actually see to those Idaho lands.
Yeah, director of Parks and Rec, Susan Buxton, she and I were hashing out like this mission to go to a gajillion different places. Because again, people like me who've moved here from out of state, we did not grow up going to the places. Like I grew up camping, my wife grew up camping, but we don't know the areas here. Right. And because of that, it's very hard for us to like reinvent the wheel because I don't have parents that live here or grandparents that live here like, hey, let me show you the ropes. So we're kind of like starting our family story over. And unless we get more direction, it's going to be really hard. And, like my kids are getting older. Like my oldest is 13. We only got a couple more summers with him before he's like, I don't want to hang out with you. So Susan Buxton and I are very thankfully she's agreed to help me go start visiting places and take me. Like we're going to Thousand Springs tomorrow. It's going to be awesome.
Oh, yeah. It's a good time of the year for that.
Oh, yeah. So like we're going to start. And she was saying a week or two ago, she's like, okay, there's just enough snow left. We could get on the snowmobiles and go up to the yurts. I'm like, the yurts? Like, what are you talking? And, we're actually saving that for next season because it's like, okay, but even if we got people looking at the yurts now, we're going at the wrong time to drive the snowmobile. So there are all of these things where it's like, if we got more people engaged and knowledgeable about what these incredible resources are, you'll have more participation. You'll have more people defending them. But if we don't help more people see that are not connected to it, then we're not going to have anybody standing up for them. We're not going to have anybody advocating to preserve them and to encourage maintenance of them, right? So that's a big piece. So I'm with you on that. I'm really excited about everything I'm going to do with Parks and Rec. It'll be pretty lit.
Perfect.
Yeah, it'd be great. Brad, thank you for coming in, sir. I really appreciate it. Let's do it again.
All right. Thank you.